Welcome to the Georgia Tech Library's Rare Book Spotlight featuring Joan Blau's Grooten Atlas. Today we'll be taking a virtual look at 3 volumes of the atlas featuring maps from the Americas, Northern Europe, Africa, and Asia. My name is Alison Reynolds. I'm the Research Services and Instruction Archivist at the Georgia Tech Library. Today I'm joined by Jim Sowell, Astronomer and Observatory Director at the Georgia Tech School of Physics, and Nick Wilding, Professor and Associate Chair of History at Georgia State University. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge and thank the people helping behind the scenes. We have Katie Gentilello, our Digital Projects Coordinator, as our production lead, who's going to be filming me as we look at the books. We have Quincy Thomas as our AV IT support, who's going to help run Blue Jeans, and Catherine Mancy, our Public Programming and Community Engagement Librarian, who coordinated the event and is going to be moderating the Q&A. So I will start us off by giving a little overview of the rare book collection at Georgia Tech, and then some background information about the Blaeu Atlas, and then point out some of my favorite maps and illustrations that I use when teaching with the Atlas classes. After that, Jim is going to talk about astronomer Tycho Brahe and his relationship to the Blaeu Atlas. And then Nick will talk about book printing and engraving, followed by the impact of the Atlas on the history of cartography, trade, and European colonialism. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the rare book collection here at Tech. Our collection largely focuses on the history of science with strengths in astronomy, physics, mathematics, engineering, and architecture. We're currently working to acquire more books that will enhance these areas and also support the current research and teaching needs of Georgia Tech faculty and students. So the rare book collection was started in earnest in the 1950s by Dorothy Crosland, who's librarian and later library director. So she traveled to Europe a lot in the 1950s to acquire new books, and in her words, it was for display purposes and to support the literature of faculty who teach chemistry, mathematics, and physics. So the story with the Blaeu Atlas is that he acquired it from someone in Amsterdam, and I was trying to find some provenance research about this because we didn't really know. And yesterday I ran across somebody's research notes who suggests that it was purchased from someone named Martinus Niehoff, who was a Dutch poet, pretty famous. And his grandfather started a publishing company in 1853 and also had a rare book trade. So the story is that she talked to Niehoff and offered him $25,000 for the Atlas, and he told her it wasn't for sale, but said that if he was going to sell it, he would sell it to her. So our library reports indicate that it was purchased in 1965 for $10,145. But we know Niehoff died in 1953, so she probably got it from his son, and maybe he gave her a discounted rate. Regardless, we got a pretty good deal on it. It was bought in memory of Mary Howard Gilbert, who was the wife of Price Gilbert that the library building here is named after. So our copy of that atlas, it's the 9-volume Dutch language atlas published in Amsterdam around 1664, 1665. This image on the PowerPoint, you can see Dorothy Crosland from the 1960s looking at the atlas. The article said that she just kept them in a stack in the corner of her office. So a little different from how we keep them now, but we're glad that they survived as long as they have. So as a set, this atlas contains about 3,300 pages and 600 maps. So I have it over here. It's a folio with hand-colored copper plate engravings bound in red Moroccan leather with a gold gilded edges, we think by a Dutch bookbinder, Albert Magnus. So it's very large and very heavy, but I'll tilt it here if you can see the engraving on the spine. Here are the atlas. So this atlas at the time was the largest map publishing project in the world, and really one of the largest and most expensive books that you could buy in the 17th century. It has copper plate engravings, and I want to show you a map of the world here. So this was really one of the first books to show the world as a hemisphere. Prior to this, they were largely flat. And this is a really interesting illustration from an artistic standpoint as well. We have the figures at the top of classical gods with the sun god Apollo in the middle here. And then on the sides, on the left, looks like Galileo, and I read some consider that to be Galileo or just a stand-in for an astronomer. And then on the right side was supposedly Tycho Brahe, much younger than the portraits I've seen of him, but also saw it could just be a stand-in for a geographer with his compass around the world. And then at the bottom is our allegorical illustrations of the 4 seasons. So spring, summer, fall, and winter. We pan across. Give me a second. Let me turn to the title page. So this atlas was printed by the Blaeu Printing Company, which was founded by Joan Blaeu's father Willem in Amsterdam in 1599. So Willem Blaeu was a famous cartographer. He also created terrestrial and celestial globes and astronomical instruments. So before establishing himself as a cartographer and printmaker, he spent several years studying under Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe at his observatory called Uraniborg on the island of Hven in Scandinavia, where he learned cosmography and map-making skills that helped him establish his business. After Willem died in 1638, Joan Blaeu took over his father's printing business as well as position of chief cartographer of the Dutch East India Company. It was during this time he compiled and published his magnum opus, the Atlas Major, which was meant to illustrate the land, sea, and sky as it was known. So here's the title page, and we have the printer's mark here, and printed in Amsterdam by Joan Blaeu, and the date on here is 1664. So I'm going to turn back to the front, and there's a really, really cool illustration, pretty famous here, that I want to show. So this is just after the title page, and this illustration is an allegorical representation of the continents gathered around a woman in a chariot pulled by lions. Each continent is represented by an allegorical figure and animal representing that geographic location. So we have the Americas here with an armadillo, the Europe wearing a crown with a horse, Asia over here with a camel, and then Africa with an elephant in the back. So I did a little bit of research to figure out who the woman in the chariot is, and I found that it's largely considered that she is the Roman Phrygian goddess Cybele, who was pretty much always depicted with lions, often in a chariot pulled by lions, wearing a crown, just like this image. He was an earth goddess called Mother of Wild Nature. So in this illustration, she represents kind of the world, and the key in her hand is the key to the knowledge of the world. So presumably you, as the owner of this atlas, have the key to the knowledge of the world in your hand. So I'm going to move over to volume 8. I have a few maps flagged here. So this first one is the Americas, so North and South America both, just called the Americas. So the maps in the atlases, they're drawn from sources coming in from across Europe, like Spain, France, England, Germany, and Portugal. It's important to note that Blaeu is not drawing the maps himself or writing the text, but acquiring them from other cartographers and getting the rights to print them, basically gathering the maps, illustrations, and text from a variety of sources and then binding them together by geographic location. So each section also contains text that describes the people, land, climate, and customs of the region. So each section contains a display map about that part of the world, and that's what this map here is. So in addition to the continents here, you can see the ships, and they have flags on them, so you can see which countries were traveling around this area. It looks like France over here. And there's also sea monsters, just some little fun illustrations of sea monsters. And then there are some illustrations on the corners that show the indigenous people, where European travelers, explorers went and drew illustrations of the indigenous people. So that's along the side. And then the top also has some illustrations of the prominent cities here in the Americas. I know we have Havana and Mexico City. So as you move inland on the map, you can see some of the geographical features that they were aware of, like rivers. I think the Rio Grande River is here in South America. Some cities that they knew about. But it's important to note that all of these are from a European perspective, and that most of these maps from the Americas were from 1609 to 1647, so much earlier than when the atlas was printed. So I'm going to move on to Asia. Made that out. So just a couple of things about the Asian map. So again, we have kind of the people along the sides and the cities at the top. A couple of interesting things, Korea, they have as a little peninsula here. And you'll see that, oh, go ahead. There's no Australia at the bottom. So the first European explorers in Australia were around 1606, but the continent was not fully charted until later into the 1700s. So this map was printed in 1617, so Australia was left out. So another interesting thing is you can see that they were aware of the Northwest Passage here. So we see the corner of the Americas, or Alaska up here in the passage. So I'm going to go back to the first volume so we can transition into the next part of the talk. So I'm going to go back to this because in Northern Europe volume is where Tycho Brahe's observatory was located. You remember earlier I mentioned that he studied, or Willem Blaeu studied under Tycho Brahe in 1595. So because of this connection, there are a lot of illustrations of the observatory and some of the astronomical tools here. So with that in mind, I'm going to transition over and let Jim talk about Brahe.
Nice. There we go. Thank you, Alison. Let me give a little historical perspective on Tycho Brahe first. So everyone has heard of Copernicus. The next astronomer who really came along was a combination of Tycho Brahe, who was born he was a nobleman, but into the middle of his life, he realized he really didn't care for the typical lifestyle of the nobility, and he became very interested in astronomy, and eventually he got the king to build this observatory complex for him. Tycho was a great observer, and I'll come to those aspects in a second, but one of the final people to work with him was Kepler, who was a theorist, and Kepler took the next step, which was saying that the orbits of objects are not perfect circles. Yes, that's the observatory complex. He was basically in charge of that whole island. But Kepler came along and really made important aspects of understanding orbits, and Kepler and Galileo were contemporaries. So Tycho's work was pre-telescopic. And if you'll go to that next picture, the important one that I want everyone to see, I think this atlas, in many ways, to me, I'm realizing is more of an encyclopedia, because not only is it an atlas, but it was talking about the peoples and animals. And here was a big section on instruments. And I want to show you how Tycho's observatory worked. Tycho realized that wind was becoming a problem. And so this was actually a couple of stories down into the ground. But you see this great big brass arc, the semicircle. So what Tycho, yes, that's it. And there's Tycho. She just ran her finger over him. He's the one pointing. He was able to get superior positions of stars. He got about 1,000 done in his lifetime. And the way astronomers did it back then and continued to do it well into the 1800s was you had a telescope that only could move in latitude, but it was pointed exactly on the meridian. And most people don't realize it, but astronomers, we're your clock people. We're your timekeepers. So the idea is there is this ring, and Tycho is pointing to a star, and there is a man to the right. If you pull the page back just a little bit, Alison, there's a man whose face is up against the ring. And so he's got a little, that's it, he'll have a little perpendicular piece. And so he's having to get the right angle pointed, and he's waiting and waiting until the star is exactly on the meridian. And then down below, there is a boy. So the man, I call this the Hey Joe method. The man is going to yell, now. The boy is going to read the time. And then over to the left of the boy is the scribe, who is going to write down the latitude of the star and the time the star was on the meridian. And Tycho's observations, you're able to repeat this. It's not like he only could do it once. He could do this over and over again. And his observations were about 10 times better than what any previous astronomer was able to do. And it's because of that higher precision that Kepler was actually able to see that the orbit of Mars in particular was not circular, but deviated slightly from it, because most orbits, except for comets, are not very much of a deviation from a circular orbit. But there are other pictures in the atlas if you happen to come by and see it. If you can zoom in on the upper right little one, it's red. There you go, you're getting close. But that come down, I love his books. Come down and a little to the left, and you see two people looking through that triangle. That is an old-fashioned sextant for looking and trying to get the angle of the sun. It's above Tycho's hand. So I just love that page, and this is the classic picture of Tycho that you will see in any astronomy textbook. And this is about all there really is of him, but he was a fascinating guy. He really didn't want his life to go for nothing. He said that even at his deathbed. And his collection of data is very important for a great start of improving our astronomical understanding. And I'll leave you with finally one little tidbit about Tycho. It's not in this drawing, but when he was 20 years old, he had a duel and he lost part of his nose, the bridge of his nose. And so the rest of his life, he had a brass nose. It sounds like he had a silver and a gold one too for very special occasions. But the brashness of youth kind of got him into trouble. But then for the rest of his life later, he was really turned out to be a great scientist, and we're very thankful. Unfortunately, that observatory doesn't exist anymore. It was destroyed by the next king, who had a falling out with Tycho. But I think the Danes and the Swedes have made a replica there on the site. So, Alison, back to you.
So now we're going to turn over to Nick to talk about the history and the impact on or the impact of the Atlas on cartography and European colonialism.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about what the book is, how it came to be what it is, and kind of what it was for. So we're looking at the Dutch edition of the Greater Atlas. It's greater than all of his competitors' atlases and everything that he'd done before. And this claim that this is somehow like the definitive, the best, the biggest, the most accurate, it should be taken with a little pinch of salt, as we'll see. Next slide, please. So more or less simultaneously, Blaeu undertook this massive printing project. So 1662 through to 1667, basically, over a 5-year span, he's producing these multi-volume global atlases. And this is not even all that he was aiming to print. This was the terrestrial part of what was meant to be, as Jim said, a kind of complete knowledge. There was supposed to be a cosmological section, an astronomical section as well, which never appeared. Just to get a sense of the kind of scale of these things, so we have the Latin edition in 11 volumes, accompanied year after by French, and then the Dutch one that we're looking at. We think that these were all printed in a minimum of about 300 copies, and it may have been up to about 500 copies. Then we have German and Spanish editions, which are a little more difficult to understand. There's more earlier material incorporated into those editions. We know a little bit about what happened to these books, how they were given as gifts. So they show up in very weird places. They're given to foreign leaders, both within Europe and outside Europe. They're given to like pirates and weird people that the Dutch are trying to impress with these gifts. And they're also sold commercially. And these aren't particularly rare, although there's no full census of extant copies, but we have a fairly high survival rate. If the print editions were numbered about 300 to 500 copies for each of the editions, if we have 100 copies of Latin, that's high survival rate. There's a motto amongst book people: bigger books linger longer. Your paperbacks get trashed, but your big, expensive books get put on a shelf and nobody ever looks at them. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So I'd just like to go into some of the kind of technologies very briefly that are used to produce this book so that we can understand the labor that's involved in the material manufacturing of the book. So here we are live with that same image. So this is the overview of Africa. If we go into the edge, any edge of this image, and let the camera kind of focus, I just want you to think about how this image is produced. So can you see there, beyond the printed image, there's a slight kind of impression there, and that's the plate press. So each of these large maps is engraved on a sheet of metal, so scratched into the surface of the metal, and then printed onto a large sheet of paper. That's a lot of work. And there's no color printing of these images. These are they're printed in black ink on white paper, and then each individual copy is hand colored. So there's variation between copies because there's no kind of paint by numbers guide to how to do this necessarily. So you get variations, and there are also different kind of levels of sumptitude. So some of the copies have gold leaf applied. This copy actually has some gold leaf. So all of the maps are engravings. We go back to the PowerPoint, please. So here's a contemporary illustration of how engravings are produced. This is a French image by Abraham Bosse from where are we? About 1645, I think, here. On the left, we have somebody etching. So that's the easier way to make a copper plate image. You scratch through a layer of wax and then pour acid onto the plate, and the acid does creates the biting hole in the plate that you can then smear with ink. Take the wax off first, then smear ink in there, and then push really, really hard with a press, and the ink will come off onto the paper. The guy on the right there is doing what we're looking at here. He's engraving. We go to the next slide, please. And this is how these images are then printed. You need a very high pressure press, and the guy with his fancy boots putting all his weight onto this thing to get the plate to run through this press is printing a single sheet, single image. If we go to the next slide, please. The other technology that's at use in this book is used to produce the text. So there's a division, and I don't think they're mixed together at all in this book. You can print both text and image on a single piece of paper, but if you're using plates, then you need to pass it through the press, two different presses. So this is how type printing is done. The guy sitting kind of close to the front is taking out individual pieces of type, composing text, putting them into a compositor's stick, and then assembling a page of text, and then assembling the multiple pages that make a form, and then the form is transferred to a press, ink is applied to it, a piece of paper is laid over it, and then that big machine on the right-hand side, somebody cranks the lever, pulls down that heavy weight, pressure is applied, and you get a printed sheet of paper, or you get one side of a sheet of paper printed. If we go to the next slide, please. I'm just trying to stress how laborious book production is, the sheer labor and the capital costs that are involved here. So if we think of the Atlas Major, just in the Latin, French, Dutch editions, because we don't really know very much about the German or Spanish ones. They seem to be more kind of cannibalized from other books. It's been calculated, and this might be idealizing things a little bit because there are other materials involved here. But the kind of minimum labor is something like this. We have, with a fairly small edition size, 300 copies per language, we have 10,000 pages of text. So that compositor is pulling out letter by letter, 10,000 pages of text. That means 5,000 folio sheets. Plus there are 600 engravings per set of atlases. In total, for these 3 language editions, that means 1.7 million sheets of paper were used to produce 300 copies of each edition. And it might have been that there were 500 copies, we don't know. And so it's been calculated that that's about 30,000 hours of printing, going at a fair speed, working 10 hours a day and not taking weekends off. And for the maps, because those presses are slower to use because they you just need to kind of inking the plates takes longer, and wiping them off and get everything to the right temperature. 54,000 hours for the map printing. So years and years of labor. So what's really remarkable about this is that it exists at all. In order to produce this, Blaeu had assembled the largest print shop in the world at that point, 9 presses, letterpress presses, working at, so if those are working at 50 sheets an hour, which is fairly quick work, he also had 6 engraving presses, so they're different kinds of machines, working at 10 sheets an hour. So we're talking a few years to print these editions. And remember, just think about the amount of capital that has to be amassed to produce these things. You've got all the labor of composing the text, doing the engravings, buying all the paper, paying the workmen for these years and years of labor, and you've got nothing to sell until the book is produced. Printing isn't the end of it. Printers don't make books, right? Printers print sheets of paper. So in this case, all of the images, or most copies have hand-colored maps. You could get black and white ones for a little cheaper. Some of them, the fancy ones, have gilding in there. And this is weird for a 17th century book, something that we think of as totally normal. You would buy the book bound. Usually for 17th century books, you buy the book in a temporary binding, and then you yourself as an owner have it bound to match your other books. Our model of buying a book already bound only comes into widespread use in the really in the early 19th century, maybe late 18th. So here we are in the late 17th century. And you bought the set bound at source. If we go to the next slide. This too is a lot of work, assembling the book. So we've got all these 1.7 million sheets of paper, and now we have to turn them into books. Now, usually when you have printed sheets, you would assemble what's called a gathering. So you get several sheets of paper, you nestle one inside the other, and then you sew through the middle of that onto a support, and then you assemble several of these gatherings, and you build a book. That's how most books are made, pre-printed as well. With these atlas books, because you have these images that you want to not have information buried into the gutter of the book, you don't want to be wondering what's being lost down in the bit of the book you can't really open up. They are all, every single sheet of this book, text and maps, are all mounted onto little stubs of paper, little guards, kind of cardboard stuff. So there's you can see, so that allows you, when you open the book, you can open the sheet flat. It also allows you to remove the maps. And lots of copies of these books have had the maps removed because they look real pretty on people's walls, and you can take these books apart and make more money out of them by mutilating them. So we have this kind of extra labor involved in putting together, turning these sheets into volumes. We go to the next slide, please. Try to make time for some questions. So it looks as though you could buy from Blaeu two different kind of qualities of binding. You could have, so top left there, the kind that we have, or that you have at Tech here, the red Morocco binding with all the gilding. And you may have seen, or we could go and have a look afterwards, that there was in the middle, there's a little medallion with a space left in it where you could then put your monogram or your coat of arms or your ownership mark to make it your copy and personalize it. You could also get it in vellum. And top right there, you could even, if you're really fancy, get a custom-made display case from the bookseller. So this is a book that comes from the bookseller direct to you as a kind of complete presentation set, even with a way to display it. You could also get it accompanied with globes. The Blau's, like many other publishers, like Janssens and lots of publishers, didn't just make what we think of as two-dimensional books, although books are clearly three-dimensional. They also made things like celestial globes, terrestrial globes, probably also were involved in instrument manufacture themselves, because incising brass is very similar to engraving plates. And so bottom left, you see unassembled gauze of a celestial, or most of a celestial globe, the only extant copy of Blau's father. Those are from Harvard. And on the right, an assembled celestial globe. So there are various ways of displaying and using, or maybe displaying is the way that you use this book. This isn't a book that you would take with you to find your way around the world, of course. This is a way of possessing the world. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So the other kind of field of labor that's we have to think about when we're looking at these books is what's happening beyond the press. Who are the books for? What kind of what use are they serving? And the main kind of resource here is the VOC, the largest company in the world, one of the first multinationals, one of the first joint stock companies. Huge success from their point of view, from the start of the 17th century right through to 1800. A multinational, so not controlled by the state, independent of the state. And by the time Blaeu is printing these atlases, they've got about 2,000 ships. They've got 30,000 sailors. They've got the largest private army in the world, 10,000 soldiers. This is a military operation. They have 50,000 employees in total. It's massive. Everybody in the Low Countries and throughout Europe, lots of people are in some way dependent on the VOC. This is the birth of multinational capitalism. This is the one of the tools of globalization, and it employs slave labor. Blaeu himself traded in slaves in the Virgin Islands. So I think it's kind of important to think, this is a beautiful, pretty, expensive book, but it both enables and depicts the process of globalization. That's not incidental. If you look at the maps, you see that what's depicted is not so. There are lots of coastal towns that are potential trade centers for European traders, but there are also natural resources. There's a kind of transformation of the world from however you might conceive of the world, a spiritual place or a series of religious empowered places, to a kind of a set of natural resources that are awaiting European exploitation. And so what we see in these books is a kind of pivotal moment there in the 1660s, this idea of possessing the world, literally in the sense of going out and trading and buying and subjugating and colonizing, but also then kind of symbolically by turning it into a book that you can have at your home and your library, if you're a wealthy person who's probably profited from the massive profits that the VOC makes. They average about 20% profit a year for the entire 2 centuries of their existence. And so it's a tool of capitalism in both senses. And I should finish by saying that Blaeu himself was the official cartographer of the VOC. He made his money by supplying all of those ships with standardized maps. And now he's sucking in that information of VOC cartography and bringing in other sources of cartography. So there are weird things like Jesuit maps of China being brought in there. Weird because Blaeu is a Protestant, so they're using Catholic knowledge. They're trying to, and a lot of these maps are kind of being cannibalized from other atlases. So this is a kind of Frankenstein monster of a world where any source that looks like it's a reasonable simulacrum of the world is deployed to make a working model of a globe that's there ready to be exploited by the Dutch. That's where I'll end. Let's move on to questions.
So Catherine, do we have any questions?
We do. Alison, the first question is, how are the striking images created? Woodcut facsimile with color added by a painter?
The images, I think Nick talked a little bit about that during his presentation, but they were engraved on the copper plates and then put through a press down on the copper plates, and then the ink would transfer on the paper, and then somebody would hand color the images. And it's interesting because they're not all the same. It wasn't a paint by number where they all look the same. I looked at that image of the woman in the chariot, about a half dozen online, and they all have different colored clothing. So each one is a little bit unique in that way.
Nick or Jim, did you want to add anything to that? Okay, thanks. Before we move on to the next question, this is Catherine Mancy. I am checking the Q&A in the chat, so if any of our attendees have questions, you are welcome to pop them into either one of those places. The next question is about Brahe. So my understanding is that Brahe effectively hedged between the geocentric Ptolemaic system and the heliocentric Copernican system. Can the speakers comment on that?
Tycho, his model was a designed by committee. He had the moon going around the Earth, and he had the planets going around the sun, but he had the sun going around the Earth. So you either had the Ptolemaic system, which was everything was going around the Earth, or you had the Copernican system that everything was going around the sun. And he firmly believed in his model, but it just wasn't there. And on his deathbed, supposedly, he pleaded with Kepler to, make certain everybody learns about my model. And Kepler was like, just give me the data. Your model is terrible. I can come up with, the Copernican view was what he was the founder, firmly behind.
Oh, Nick, you're muted.
I tried to unmute.
Oh, you're unmuted now.
Okay.
Go ahead.
The Blaus, along with a group of Dutch intellectuals, actually invited Galileo after the trial in 1633, where Copernicanism was pretty much banned. Let's say it how it is. In Catholic lands, they invited Galileo to get out of jail somehow or other, or out of house arrest, and come and live in Amsterdam. He kind of realized that wasn't a very good idea. That would definitely lead to the stake if he were captured, and he was in his 70s. And so he told the Inquisition that he'd been asked to do that. They were interested in having him for a variety of reasons. I think part of it was probably to annoy the Inquisition, but also there was an intellectual commitment to Copernicanism that was really taking off in the 1620s onwards. When Galileo writes his Dialogo in or publishes it in 1632, it's called the Dialogue of the Two Chief World Systems. Tycho at that point has dropped out, and it's just Ptolemaic and Copernican. He doesn't want to talk about Tycho. He's going to try and make a really bad Encanto gag there. We don't talk about Tycho. So they have a commitment to Copernicanism, and Blaeu was actually the first person to publish maps or cosmologies with a pro-Copernican commitment. So the sun is at the center there, depicted as Apollo, and he places the planets as gods around Apollo in the correct Copernican order. So we're in this. But there's also this kind of family link, as Jim said, to Tycho and Gruten and that legacy. And in the opening, there's a kind of discussion. It could be this way or it could be this way, but it seems pretty clear. And basically, for navigators, it doesn't matter very much, frankly. For terrestrial navigation, it doesn't change things a whole lot. What cosmology you deploy at this stage. We're not GPSing yet. So they're kind of committed Copernicans, but they give a little nod to the Ptolemaic and the Tychonic systems along the way.
Thank you for that. Alison, can I move to the next question? We have quite a few coming in.
Sure.
The next question is, are there any, for lack of a better term, false places in the atlas? So maybe places like Mountains of Kong. You know?
I don't know if there are any completely incorrect ones. I know I showed that map of Asia where it has Korea as almost an island, like peninsula, which we know is not accurate. The one of the Americas, you can see it's really carved, and the Gulf of Mexico is really carved into the continent. So it's almost like Florida, Georgia, the whole South just doesn't exist as the ocean. So we know now that there's much more land in the southern United States, so North America, than they did at that time. But I haven't looked at all of them closely enough to see if there's anything that's completely wrong, like a random island or something. So No, it's a good question. Be interesting to find out.
Yeah. Nick or Jim, do you know? There any just completely false places?
And most of the cartographic material is pulled in from other sources, so there's no intentional deception. It's just kind of what we now think of as inaccurate cartography. So I think probably California is an island in this because it remained an island for a really long time, as far as cartographers were concerned. But there's no. And one of the weird things is that there are you don't find, say, in the interior of Africa, terra incognita. Like there's a really dense knowledge of most of the world, and you don't really see this kind of what you see in older maps of kind of hierarchies of like, well, we know Europe really well because we have the Ptolemaic mapping tradition, but we have no idea about China. Like every city in China is depicted there because there are these global networks like the VOC, like the Jesuits, like the English East India Company, the West India Company. There's information is flowing into these centers of calculation from all over the place here. And even, Tasmania has been discovered. The interior of Australia is still unknown, and the southern coast of Australia. But there's no kind of internal deception or even kind of whimsy there. It's turning into something like the modern world, like it's recognizably a modern atlas.
I'm only familiar with the Blaeu section, but I'm sorry to hear there was supposed to be an astronomical atlas, and that I would have enjoyed seeing.
I guess there were other rival books out there like Hevelius that were doing it pretty well. The Jesuits had got on top of this by this point, I think.
Thank you for those great answers. The next question we have is about the different number of volumes. So what accounts for the different number of volumes in the different language editions? Nick, do you know?
Well, the information, the maps are generally repurposed, although there are a different number of maps. And they seem to kind of do each edition for different audiences. So the French map has, say, more of New France and French imperial holdings in it. Each one is kind of the world seen from a different point of view. So the material is reorganized. I don't think the text is just straight translation. I think that they kind of conceive of each edition as the world seen from and for a different audience. So I guess they chop it up into different sizes. The more number of volumes you have, even for the same number of sheets, the greater the cost is going to be. So it might also be that there's a kind of economy of scale, and that they start off thinking, there's a physical limit to the number of pages you can comfortably bind into a volume, especially if you're doing it with this complex guard system. But probably, it's cheaper to sell a 9-volume set than an 11-volume set because you haven't had to pay the binder to do those extra 2 volumes for each one. So it might just be that they kind of are trying to cut costs a little bit with the Dutch one. But that's a really good research question. I don't know if anybody's actually gone and kind of collated the presence of each map in each book and worked out what gets shuffled. I mean, bureaucratically, this is an insane thing to do. A multilingual 9 to 12 volume, 600 map description of the world. Just think of just tracking all of those documents in terms of file management. And you're doing it over 1,000 copies. It's kind of amazing that any of these things actually come out right.
Yeah, with that, I'm going to ask the next few questions out of order because I'm interested. But the next question is, how on earth did they afford this? Like, how would 300 copies recoup the cost? And do you know how much a set costs? And this is for kind of any of our panelists.
There is a nice. This book has a lot of the answers. Joan Blaeu and his great atlas. There's also a really lovely book, Jerry Grooten, History of the World in 12 Maps. You can get it paperback as well. There's a chapter on this book, which I drew on heavily for this account. There are contemporary pricings of these things. It's basically, it's basically skilled laborer, probably several years' salary. So these are not at all affordable for the vast majority of people. I mean, nowadays this set would cost somewhere between $500,000 and I think this one's appraised at 1.1 million. The set, because it's in nice condition. It probably wasn't a whole lot cheaper back then, which is kind of shocking. This isn't something that's massively gone up in value. This was the most expensive book ever published, and lots of these things were given away as gifts. So to people like Colbert, the guy behind the scenes of Louis XIV, and so there's this. But in terms of the capital required just to produce these things, Blaeu had made himself a lot of money by being the VOC official cartographer. He has this basic monopoly on mapping for the entire VOC, and he insists that every ship has like a set of identical maps, and he sets the price. So there are invoices from him where he's like, "Yeah, you owe me like $500,000 this week." So the capital is generated by the VOC, and then and they're pulling in huge amounts of money, and so there's this weird kind of nepotistic, or I don't know, maybe this is just how it's meant to work. But that's where the money's coming from the VOC, and the maps are going probably to VOC shareholders as well.
Yeah, thank you. Here's a very quick question. Someone said, maybe I missed this, but what does Grooten mean?
It's the Dutch version, so it's Grooten Atlas, but it translates to Grand Atlas, or more commonly Atlas Major, what I've seen.
Question, and this one is kind of a large-scale question. So how did Blau's atlas shape subsequent cartography?
Read Jerry Grooten, see what happens next. He has this as a chapter on like the shift to money, basically, to get from there to where are we now with atlases. This is the atlas most of us use, right? The whole world fits in there now, whatever scale you want. But from the projections that he's using become fairly standardized, despite all the controversy over how a projection distorts the world. I mean, this basically sets a kind of a standard that then gets supplemented by greater kind of national, more detailed national cartographic projects and imperial projects. So you have resulting in, by the end of the 19th century, I think things like the Ordnance Survey mapping of India or the United Kingdom, or similar French national and imperial ventures to map. There's also a kind of a weird subtext here where VOC maps are also kind of trade secrets, right? If whoever knows what the world looks like has access to it. And especially when you're looking for spice islands in the East Indies, mapping knowledge is something that's historically tightly controlled. So the Spanish were the great experts on keeping cartography secret. The last thing you want to do is go and publish it. This venture, there's some evidence that the VOC, despite Blaeu being the VOC official cartographer, he had a kind of non-disclosure agreement where he couldn't use the most detailed, most accurate maps that that would give the competitors the edge. So I guess that then shifts into a kind of enlightenment tension of wanting full disclosure of the world, and opening up those last bastions of kind of private cartographic knowledge or corporate secret cartographic knowledge. And we see that still today. Turn on the news and you may well see some satellite footage of Ukraine. There we see private and state, but tightly controlled, militarized cartographic knowledge being deployed in real time. That's what happens next, I guess.
Thank you so much, Nick. I think that's a really great large-scale question to end on, but I have one more question for each of our panelists before we end today. So my last question is just, what is your favorite thing about the Atlas? I know all three of you have had a chance to see it in person many times. So I'll start with you, Jim. What's your favorite thing about the Atlas?
I like how it is so multidimensional in that I like it because there's an astronomy section. My wife Virginia is here today because she's an artist. I wanted her to see the beautiful paintings there. It covers, I'm always wanting to learn. And the Atlas/encyclopedia is the kind of thing that you could open and you would be learning. I liked what Nick said about it. It gives you the world. And I like that it's old and it's lasted. It's lasted a lot longer than I have. So that's kind of impressive.
Nick, what about you?
I found a wormhole, which I really liked. That sounds weird, but like a little insect had eaten a hole. And the thing that I like about it is that it shows, because this is so geeky, but this is what book people do sometimes. It shows that the sheets that the hole goes through, like usually if you find a wormhole, it'll lead its way up and down through a book. And there are different kinds of worms that eat in different directions, and you can tell where the book's been depending on the wormhole. This is just through one sheet, which normally would make you think that that sheet has been inserted later into the book, taken from another copy, and that someone's mucked about with it. But there's no evidence of that in this copy. So what it actually means is that sheet had been printed for another book. So I said that some of this book is kind of cannibalized from other Blaeu publications. The Dutch material comes from an earlier Dutch atlas that he'd made, and then he repurposes it, and because he hasn't been able to sell it. So this thing had been sitting somewhere, a worm had eaten through it, and probably the whole stack of other ones. You could probably find the same wormhole in different copies around the world. And then he took that sheet and shoved it in this book and made like my brand new best-selling, most accurate ever map of the world using these 20 or 15 or 20-year-old maps. So I love the way that like little copy-specific bits of evidence like that tell you stories about how the thing came to be how it is.
I love that. Well, Alison, we'll end with you. What's your favorite thing?
I love all the illustrations. In preparing for this, I did research on some of those early illustrations, and I learned about all the allegories, and I hadn't realized that before, so I kind of want to go back through and see if there are any others that I can research. There's buildings in here. There's an animal of a walrus that I didn't have time to show, but it's one of my favorites, and a very full-page fold-out copy of the Renaissance cathedral in Spain called El Escorial. It is just gorgeous, and I've only really looked at these 3 volumes. We have 6 more that I haven't even opened, so I wish I had time to just dig through all of them and learn about all of the illustrations.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Alison, for a great program today. A virtual round of applause. I know you can't hear us, but we're all clapping on the other end of our computers. And I'd like to invite everyone here today to attend future Georgia Tech Library public programming. I've put the link to our library events, but you can also just Google Georgia Tech Library events and see what workshops and programs we're putting on for the community. So thank you again for attending today.